Então, boa tarde a todos, todas. Muito obrigado pela presença. Então, vamos dar início à palestra da Myrto Aloumpi. Eu vou fazer uma breve apresentação dela e depois lhe passar a palavra, né? Em primeiro lugar, gostaria de agradecer ao programa de pós-graduação em Letras, que conseguiu financiamento e tal para nós trazermos aqui, e também ao Departamento de Filosofia, pós-graduação em Filosofia, que ajudou na organização, mas em especial o professor Rodrigo Tadeu, que é o grande responsável para que isso tenha funcionado, né? Então, a Myrto, ela é pesquisadora, atualmente está fazendo um pós-doutorado com CAPS-Print na UFMG, mas ela possui graduação em Filologia Grega pela Univerisdade de Creta e pós-graduação na Universidade de Oxford. Leciona as línguas clássicas, literatura e história, com ênfase em democracia ateniense, política, discurso público, moralidade do povo e valores sociais, mobilidade da população e interação entre cidadãos e estrangeiros do mundo antigo, com publicações sobre Demóstenes e Plutarco. Ela realizou o pós-doutorado na Universidade de Creta, na Faculdade de Filologia, com o projeto chamado Civic Obligation and Social Political Immobility, Foreigners and the Shaping of Athenian Citizenship, que faz parte de um projeto mais amplo denominado Athenian Citizenship Networks of Citizens and Foreigners in Democratic Athens. E ela foi pesquisadora no projeto Covid-19, Estando Sozinho em Conjunto, algo do gênero, no Departamento de Comunicação e Mídia da Universidade de Liverpool, contribuindo com seu conhecimento em retórica e oratória na Grécia Antiga, para propiciar meios de verificar fatos em meio à infodemia. E ela integra o Centro de Oratória e Retórica da Universidade de Londres e realiza atualmente, como eu disse no início, um estágio de pós-doutorado no Departamento de Filosofia da UFMG. Então, Myrto, it's a great pleasure to have you here. I hope you enjoy Curitiba and also UFPR, so you have the word.
Thank you, Michael, for...
Here, just with...
Thanks, Maicon, for the introduction and for the kind invitation. I'm very happy to be here, and apologies for the delay, but Red Hot Chili Peppers are partially responsible for that. The rest is, I take it.
So at the end, we have the room for questions, and if anyone wants to pose a question in Portuguese, we can translate it, just to say that, okay? So please.
So I would like to start by saying a few words about the broader research project under which falls today's paper, and also the research I'm going to do this year at ufmg. As Maicon mentioned, the broader project is entitled Athenian Citizenship, Networks of Citizens and Foreigners in Democratic Athens, and you can see that in the second slide. So classical Athens was a cosmopolitan city with many non-native residents and lots of interaction with foreigners, individuals, groups, and state authorities. Nevertheless, citizenship was rarely granted to citizens. At the same time, we have evidence that the Athenian state allowed or encouraged, in some cases, the participation of foreigners in the rights and in the obligations of Athenian citizens. So my research project analyzes a corpus of literary and material sources which discuss this participation of foreigners in the rights and obligations of Athenian citizenship in order to reconstruct, first, the broad field of reciprocity in which this interaction played out, and second, the ensuing tensions among citizens, foreigners, and the city. It has already been discussed in scholarship the idea that the boundaries between legally separate groups, foreigners and citizens and slaves, were in reality blurred, both at the level of rhetoric and in practice. So poor slaves, poor foreigners who lived in Athens, the so-called metics, and poor Athenian citizens did not in fact differ substantially in terms of how they led their daily lives. So my project moves along these research lines, but turns its interest at the other end of the spectrum, the relationship between wealthy citizens and wealthy foreigners, and the concomitant effect on Athenian citizenship. By demonstrating how the boundaries between legally separate groups were blurred officially, rhetorically, and in practice, the project aims to show the crucial role played by foreigners of all ranks in shaping Athenian citizenship and political and social identities. I will not get into detail today regarding the methodology of the whole project, nor am I going to present you the whole corpus of sources, of primary sources on which the project is based. But I would like to refer to a couple of general goals of the whole project. First, at the level of research, it seeks to reshape the way in which we perceive Athenian citizenship and Athenian democracy in general. And this project wishes to do that by incorporating the active role of the foreigners, especially the wealthy foreigners. And second, at the level of society, this project wishes to contribute to current debates regarding migration and mobility, assimilation, citizenship, and national sovereignty. And this goal, the second research goal, is the starting point for today's lecture. And by that, I mean the social footprint of this project and the broader framework of reflection in which it belongs. It is perhaps obvious to say that contact with foreigners, probably in any time and in any society, shapes the concept of citizenship, both ideologically and in practice. Let us take two relatively recent examples. The first example is Brexit, the exit of the UK, United Kingdom, from the European Union. Particularly prevalent among low-income groups was the attitude that because of European policies on migration and mobility, economic migrants, especially from Eastern Europe, but also from the Middle East and Africa, were free to reside in the UK and, as they said, steal jobs that were intended for British citizens. And much of the wave of support for Brexit was a reaction to this perception of reality. In this context, being British is seen as a valuable commodity that comes with a set of privileges and rights that Brexiteers were not willing to share with others, with foreigners. At the same time, pro-Brexit people were also people who did not necessarily feel that they were being harmed economically by migration, but believed that leaving the European Union would be a step towards regaining national sovereignty. So in their minds, through leaving the European Union, Britain would cease to be dependent on European policies, laws, and regulations, which allegedly compromised sovereignty. The second example concerns modern Greece. So we are in 2019, just before the parliamentary elections, and one of the last policies with a social humanitarian bias that the center-left government tried to pass back then was the simplification of the procedure by which foreigners, including immigrants and refugees and refugee children, could obtain a national insurance number, which is necessary if you want to work or get health insurance in the country. Shortly afterwards, when the Conservative Party eventually won the election, this measure was one of the first to be revoked. The revocation of the measure was presented by the new minister as a way to safeguard the sovereignty of the country. And it is important to stress here that in the public rhetoric of the last years, all policies related to limitations placed upon refugees and immigrants are presented as a way to safeguard and ensure the sovereignty of the country. Now, many people reacted to this rhetoric, accusing the new minister of racism, of supporting policies that contradict the recent wave of humanitarianism and solidarity towards refugees, of violating human rights, and of depriving vulnerable groups of easy access to fundamental goods such as health, education, and the right to work. At the same time, a significant part of Greek society supported the minister's decision, considering the policy a threat to their rights and privileges as Greek citizens. This kind of rhetoric may resonate with a section of poorer citizens who may fear of losing any benefits if they start sharing them with more people, with foreigners. But the resonance of this rhetoric is likely to be related to more fundamental ideological concerns, according to which certain political rights and benefits are seen as metonyms of citizenship itself. And in this sense, opening up certain rights and benefits to third parties could be considered by some citizens as granting a part of their political and national identity that they were not willing to do. I have given these two recent examples to show to you in a more direct way the political and ideological context in which my research project belongs. We can see that the possibility of foreigners participating in the rights and obligations of citizenship is a ground of debate at the level of politics. And as far as citizens are concerned, we saw that the participation of foreigners in the rights and obligations of citizens can be seen as hijacking performative aspects of citizenship, which can trigger a variety of reflexes depending on one's socioeconomic status, depending on one's political beliefs and their codes of values in general. Now, population movements, as well as the coexistence of citizens and foreigners, are diachronic and sensitive issues. In the Greek world of the 4th century BCE, many Greek cities were affected by wars of conquest, by civil strife and disasters that resulted in the displacement of populations. These displacements could take many forms, such as persecution, search for refuge, and the evacuation of cities. At the same time, economic migration in search of better opportunities was also a widespread phenomenon, not necessarily the result of war or other unexpected changes in living conditions at home. Today, I will explore how foreigners, be they traders, merchants, refugees, political exiles, or permanent residents of Athens, metics, through their presence and their contribution to Athenian society in the 4th century BCE, may have influenced the public life of Athenian citizens and contributed to the shaping of Athenian citizenship and its obligations. And we can move to the next slide. In a recent study entitled The Perpetual Immigrant and the Limits of Athenian Democracy, Dimitra Kasimis employs the category of the metic, who is a free foreigner and permanent resident at Athens, to make a very interesting hypothesis about how precarious Athenian citizenship was. So according to Cassimi's argument, I quote, "The metic is the naturally undeserving, inadequate, but dangerously good copy of the citizen." And why is this the case? Precisely because the metic is free, just as the Athenian citizen is free, and the metic can also participate in many aspects of Athenian socioeconomic life. The only thing that differentiates the metic, the permanent foreigner, the permanent resident from the citizen is that the former does not have Athenian blood. And not having Athenian blood means that you cannot participate in the political life of the city. However, the common aspects of daily life shared by Athenians and foreign permanent residents could be used by metics to pretend that they were citizens. And they could also be used against citizens to challenge their citizenship and their legitimate participation in the body of citizens. One of the case studies that illuminate Cassimi's argument is speech 57 of Demosthenes. This is a forensic speech. It was delivered in a law court in 346-345 BCE. And this speech precisely shows how precarious, how in danger was the position of citizens, especially of poor Athenian citizens. Let's see the case. The speaker, Euxytheus, had recently lost his citizenship, and as a consequence, he had fallen to the status of the metic, of the resident foreigner. And the speech under consideration, from which comes the passage that you can see, comes from the trial of appeal against this decision. Now, if Euxytheus lost this appeal, he was in danger of being sold as a slave. If he won, he would become a citizen again. So we see that the stakes are very high in this trial. The main opponent of Euxytheus is named Eubulides. And Eubulides was one of those who had started the process by which Euxytheus had lost his citizenship. And he is also one of the main opponents in this trial. That's why the speech has the title Against Eubulides. Save his name for later because we will get back to him. Now let's see the rhetoric that the speaker uses. Euxytheus defends his citizenship and tries to convince the judges that he should be included again in the body of Athenian citizens. And two particularly important arguments that were used against him are the following ones, to which Euxytheus now responds. First, that his father has a foreign accent and therefore he is not Athenian. And the second argument is that he and his mother are engaged in petty professional activities and therefore they are not Athenians. Regarding the first argument, Euxytheus explains that due to fulfilling his military obligations as an Athenian citizen, his father was captured and he was sold as a slave. And only after some time was he able to return to Athens and be accepted again as a citizen. As Euxytheus notes, his father's misfortunes during his military service do not support the claim that he is foreigner, but on the contrary, they verify the fact that he is an Athenian citizen, precisely because they are examples of his patriotism and successful fulfillment of his obligations as a citizen. So we read in the first passage, You see, they slander my father when they say he spoke like a foreigner. They leave out the fact that he was captured by the enemy during the Decalian War and sold into slavery, then taken to Lucas, where he fell in with Cleandrus the actor, and after a long interval returned safely to his family. So they accuse him of speaking with an accent, as though we should be ruined on account of his bad luck. But I think I can demonstrate to you from these very facts that I am an Athenian. So I will provide witnesses, first, that he was captured and returned safely. Then, that on his return, he got a share of his uncle's property. And further, that no one ever accused him, not among the Deme members, not among his fellow fratry members, not anywhere else, of being an alien on the ground that he spoke with an accent. As for the second argument, and this is the next slide, the argument that his family's occupations are menial, Euxithius explains that menial jobs were not done exclusively by resident foreigners, but also by Athenians, that they are indicative of his family's poverty, not of his family's political status. So rather than leaving out all the unfortunate family details that were used against him, Euxithius demonstrates their polysemy. He suggests that to accuse a poor, working Athenian family of fraudulent citizenship is not only unsupportable in this instance, but it is also undemocratic, precisely because poverty can be identified in public discourse with being a non-citizen. And let's see the words that the speaker is using. We do acknowledge that we sell ribbons and do not live in the style we would like. And you bully this. If you take this as a sign that we are not Athenians, I will show you the exact opposite, that an alien is not permitted to work in the agora. And later, he continues, he also has said this about my mother, that she was a wet nurse. We do not deny that this happened when the city suffered misfortune and everybody was doing badly. I will tell you clearly how and for what reason she was a wet nurse. None of you men of Athens should take this in the wrong way, since even now you will find that many Athenian women are wet nurses. If you wish, I will identify them for you by name. Now, if we were rich, we would not be selling ribbons, nor would we be in such a dire straits. But what does this have to do with our ancestry? Nothing, in my opinion. No, gentlemen of the jury, do not dishonor the poor. Being poor is trouble enough for them, or those who choose to work and get a living by honest means. So, we see in this speech and through Kasimi's argument and analysis that despite the clear legal distinction between citizens and metics, the fact that in practice the daily life of poor Athenians and poor metics was similar could complicate matters, especially what it meant in practice to be an Athenian citizen. And the case of Euxithius demonstrates that in practice, the daily life of a poor Athenian citizen could be used as evidence for both, as evidence that one was a genuine Athenian citizen, and as evidence that one was not a genuine Athenian citizen. Along the same lines also goes the argument of Vlasopoulos, who identifies similarities in the everyday life of poor Athenians and slaves, and shows how the lower social strata of citizens were in danger of being classified as slaves, and of losing, both on an ideological and practical level, their political rights and their citizenship. We can move to the next slide. But what happens at the other end of the social ladder? What about the rich Athenians? To what extent were wealthy Athenians, their status as citizens, and more generally their standing in society, affected by the presence of wealthy foreigners with whom they may have shared aspects of their daily lives, but also other experiences on a more official level, such as the fulfillment of the same civic obligations? I will examine, in the rest of this presentation, some instances in which the city of Athens rewarded foreign residents and other subgroups of foreigners in such a way as to bring them closer to what it meant in practice to be an Athenian citizen, and particularly a wealthy Athenian citizen. More specifically, I will examine a small group of state honorary inscriptions which granted to foreigners the right or obligation, if you wish, to pay a particular capital tax, which was called eisphora, along with the Athenians, or like the Athenians, as these inscriptions read. And this, I believe, was one possible way in which contact with foreigners shaped Athenian citizenship at an official level through the fulfillment of civic obligations. Let's start by seeing what an eisphora was. Eisphora was an extraordinary capital tax on the property of the free residents of Attica. So both citizens and free foreigners had to pay it. It was based on the individual's own declared assessment of his taxable capital. So, as I mentioned, both citizens and foreigners, free foreigners that stayed in Attica were liable to it, but they did not pay it at the same rate. We will get back to it later. Now, a capital tax does indeed look more as an obligation, and probably a heavy obligation, rather than as a privilege. But in spite of that, in the classical period, from the classical period, we have 7 honorific inscriptions which grant to foreigners, among other things, the right to pay this capital tax along with the Athenians. So this is presented as an honor, because these inscriptions are honorific. I have categorized these 7 inscriptions according to the type of benefaction and service that these foreigners did for Athens, and in exchange, let's say, of it, they get honors, and among them the right to pay this capital tax along the Athenians. So let's move to the next slide. In the first category, we have 2 inscriptions which honor foreigners for military and political services. Both groups of honorants are political exiles who are granted the right to reside in Athens with the proviso that they return home as soon as possible. So we see again that here we can see we can get a hint into the attitude of Athens in general. Athens as a city that welcomes foreigners from friendly cities, but also as a city that wants them out of Athens as soon as they can be back home. The first inscription is from 346, 345, and honors a group of citizens from Abdera. Abdera was a member of the Second Athenian League, but in 345 they probably aligned with Philip of Macedon, and so this group of exiles probably remained loyal to Athens. That's why they were exiled, and so Athens accepts them. I have provided here the entire inscription for you to see. In the first part, who was the citizen who made the proposal to honor this group of foreigners? As you see in the highlighted part, it is Eubulides, the same person that we saw earlier in this speech of Demosthenes, as being the opponent of Euxithus, an Athenian citizen that was, and as being actually one of the people who were actually responsible for kicking a citizen out of the citizen body. So we see the same person as the protagonist in two cases which in theory are diametrically opposed. In the case of the speech we saw earlier, we have the removal of an Athenian citizen from the citizen body, and in the case of this inscription here, we have the honoring of a group of foreigners from the city. In the case of Euxithus, we have seen how the stereotype of the foreigner, the metic, can be used against a citizen to damage his image and his standing in the society. So there, the foreigner is viewed as inferior to Athenian citizens, as unworthy of Athenian citizenship. Whereas in this honorary inscription that we see now, a specific group of foreigners is elevated to the status of benefactors of Athens. And the city of Athens is ready to welcome this group of foreigners, even though temporarily, as I mentioned earlier, they should go back home as soon as they can. And the city of Athens is also ready to assimilate this group of foreigners, even though partially. As you can see in the last bit of the inscription, the highlighted part, they get the right or obligation to pay the capital taxes along with the Athenians. So they get access to a performative aspect of Athenian citizenship. Now, what we may assume from Eubulides' actions in these two cases, in the one he was responsible of expelling a citizen, in the other he is responsible of honoring a group of foreigners, what we may assume is that in the consciousness of Athenian citizens, various and often conflicting beliefs about foreigners probably coexisted. And think about mobility and migration in our times too, both in the case of the Brexit rhetoric that we saw earlier, but also in the case of Mediterranean countries which get waves of migration from the Middle East and Africa. It is usually the poor and the ones that need more, that they need benefits, that are not easily accepted. Whereas many people's attitude is different towards wealthy European white immigrants. The second inscription in the next slide comes from a little later, 338, 337, and honors a group of political exiles from Acarnania who are again granted residence at Athens until they are able to return home. They're granted the right to own land, because only citizens were allowed to own land or a house. And they are also granted several other rewards, including the one that interests me today, the right or obligation to pay the capital taxes with the Athenians. And we read in this inscription that these Acarnanians are, in a different part of the inscription actually, that these Acarnanians are honored for their help. Most probably they had fought at the Battle of Chaeronea along the Athenians and against Philip, and therefore were subsequently expelled by Philip, and they sought refuge at Athens. The number of rewards they are given, including exemption from the tax to which foreign residents were liable. This is a different tax, not the eisphora. Indicates that this group of refugees were granted above metic status, so they were getting more honors. But again, they were not granted citizen status. Athens was really, really strict with that. Under the second category, in the next slide, we have two inscriptions which honor possibly metics for trade-related services. These two inscriptions belong to a group of inscriptions from the second half of the 4th century, which honor foreign merchants and ship owners for their services in relation with grain supply during periods where Athens experienced grain shortages. The fact that the city responded to such services with rewards shows that it had to rely on the generosity of the merchants in order to secure its grain supply and in order to be able to feed its population. And at the same time, these rewards worked as an incentive for other merchants or for the same merchants to do similar services in the future. So they could give them a donation in grain, or they could agree to sell grain and barley in lower prices, as we will see. So the first inscription honors a professional trader named Dionysius for his gift of 3,000 medimnoi of grain when the city was in need. And the quantity, 3,000 medimnoi, indicates that Dionysius must have been a very wealthy man. And for this reason, he is granted the privilege to pay capital taxes with the Athenians and also the privilege to serve in the military with the Athenians, so in the same ranks with the citizens, even though a foreigner. The second inscription comes from the 320s and honors Heracleides of Salamis, a wealthy professional trader, for, I'm quoting now the services from a part of the inscription that you cannot see because this is a very big inscription. So Heracleides is honored for selling imported goods at a reduced price. And he's also honored for a gift of money to buy imported goods. This honorant, too, is granted, among other things, the right to pay the capital taxes with the Athenians, as you can read at the end of the inscription. The nature of the rewards that both these honorants receive, they receive the right to own land, they receive the right to serve in the military with the Athenians, and the right to pay the capital taxes with the Athenians. And also the fact that at least Heracleides had performed services for Athens, similar services, more than once, indicate that these two individuals had a very close relationship with the city. and this in turn may indicate that they resided at Athens, that they were permanent residents, because this would facilitate all their trading activities with Athens. Under the third category, in the next slide, we have an inscription from the 330-329, which honors Eudymos of Plataea for proclaiming to contribute 4,000 drachmas for the war, and also for proclaiming to donate 1,000 yoke of animals for the construction of the stadium and the theater and the Panathenaic theater. And this is actually one of the earliest inscribed decrees which honor foreigners for theater-related services. Again, the nature of and we have to note that we are at the time, the end of the classical period, where the most active politician is Lycurgus, who is very interested in reforming Athens financially, and he does very well in this respect. And also, he's very interested in reviving the theatrical tradition of Athens. So this inscription belongs to the Lycurgan time, the end of the classical period, when Athens is trying to attract foreigners to contribute to the revival of the classical, the 5th century tradition of the city. So, again, in this case too, the nature of the awards that Eudymos takes, he gets the right to own land, the right to serve in the military with the Athenians and pay the taxes with the Athenians, indicates that he was probably also a permanent resident of the city. But it is also the nature of Eudymos' benefaction that enforces this argument, that he was a permanent resident. It was a common way for an young and ambitious Athenian citizen to enter public life in Athens. A common way to do it was to make a donation related to the theater, to become a sponsor in a theatrical performance, for example. And perhaps this inscription indicates that this was a way to win capital, to win social capital for permanent foreign residents as well. So in this case, Eudymos, through his donation for the construction of the Panathenaic Stadium and the theater, may be seeking this similar type of social recognition. And if this is correct, then we see another case, another field in which the arena of public recognition is shared between wealthy citizens and wealthy foreigners. They compete in one more field in the same way. In the last category, in the next slide, which I have given in the original Greek, I wasn't aware of how many people read Greek, so I gave most of the inscriptions in translation, but I left the last ones in the original. So in this case, we have two very fragmentary inscriptions. Both come from the second half of the 4th century, but the last one might not come from the classical times, might come from the 310s. We're not sure about the dating. In both cases, the honorands as well as the benefactions are unknown. We don't have the part of the inscription that explains who these people are or what they have done. So we cannot know whether they were permanent residents of Attica, but they must have been foreigners. And we know that from the nature of the rewards that they get. In the first one, they get proxeny. Proxeny, being a proxenos, was an honorific title given to foreigners who were willing to serve the interests of Athens in their own hometown, kind of an ambassador, let's say. So they were definitely foreigners since they were granted this title, the title of proxeny. And they were also granted isoteleia, so this is the right to pay the same taxes as the Athenians. And they are also granted the right or obligation to pay the capital taxes with the Athenians. So we saw that in all of these inscriptions, we saw that the city may reward a variety of benefactions and services. We have seen groups of exiles, groups of refugees who are honored for their political and military stance towards Athens. We have seen grain merchants who contribute directly to the survival of the city with their gifts and their discounts in prices. We have seen also the case of Eudemus, who is interested in the show business of the city and with his contribution for the construction of the Panathinaik Theatre and the stadium. And we've seen also these last inscriptions that we don't know what they are really about. The common element of all these inscriptions that is important for my research is that they honor these foreigners with the right or obligation to pay capital taxes with the Athenians. But first, we have to examine why this is an honor and what it meant in practice. Let's move to the next slide. Several explanations have been proposed depending on whether it is taken that the foreigners normally paid more or less in capital taxes compared to the Athenians. And the evidence you can see on this slide is the only evidence we have for calculating the rate of payment for the foreigners. So we learn from a passage in Demosthenes' speech 22, the one you have on the left, that, and we also have one inscription, the passage on the right, which is about the repair of the walls of Piraeus. And we learn from those two sources that the metics had to contribute a sixth part of the capital tax. This is all we know. But what does the sixth part mean? This is quite difficult to understand. So we have several explanations have been proposed. The Sainte Croix has suggested that the metics had to contribute 1/6 of their total self-declared property every time they were called to pay an isphora. But Mustafa Adak is, I think, right to reject this proposition because such a tax rate is incredibly high. Especially if we take into account that in the 4th century, this tax, Athens was in a difficult financial situation, so this, let's say, extraordinary tax became much more regular. So if the foreigners had to pay every time 1/6 of their total property, they would lose all their property pretty quickly. So I think ADAC is right to reject this proposal as being too high a tax rate. It has also been suggested that the METICs probably had to cover each time 1/6 of the total amount that the city asked. But again, this amount seems to be too small compared to the other 5/6 that the citizens had to pay. And if this was the case, then when the city honors foreigners with the right to pay as much as the Athenians, then it gives them actually a huge burden, right? To pay the 5/6. So this is not really an honor if we take it like that. But still, there are people like Whitehead that suggest that just to be included in the ranks of the citizens and paying as much as the citizens is an honor in itself, even if this means paying much more. So this could be an explanation, but I'm not 100% convinced. I'll get back to it later. I think that in terms of calculating the amount, I agree with Mustafa Adak, who proposes that paying with the Athenians means paying less than normally. And if this is correct, then paying 1/6 of the capital tax could mean that normally the METICs had to pay as much as the citizens plus 1/6 of that amount on top. So when they are honored with paying as much as the citizens, they pay 1/6 less. This is the proposition of ADAC, which I think is the most probable. But whether these honorants paid more or less, the important thing is that through these grants, they gained access to performative aspects of Athenian citizenship, as they got to perform civic obligations on equal terms as the Athenians. According to Engen in his book Honor and Profit, this honorific habit had a social cost for Athens. And according to Engen, this practice had a social cost because it opened up the exclusive domain of civic values to foreigners and put them on an equal footing to the citizens. As a response to Engen, I have a more positive suggestion to put forward today. We know from the speeches of the Attic orators, and this is, you can see an example in the next slide. We know from their speeches that wealthy citizens used evidence for their successful performance of their civic obligations as tokens of as evidence of their credibility, as evidence of their democratic spirit and their egalitarian stance. So we have speakers defending themselves in a law court and saying, I am a good citizen because I have served in the military as I had to serve, because I have sponsored theatrical performances, because I have paid my capital taxes every time the city has called. These are arguments usually made in a law court in classical Athens, and it sounds a bit odd compared to modern standards, but character construction was really important back then. So they would provide evidence of their good citizenship in order to appear in better light in front of the judges. So public service had a prominent position in arguments, in legal arguments that aimed to evoke a sense of reciprocity and a sense of mutual obligation between the good citizen and the city who recognizes the service of the good citizen. Now, this kind of arguments were also employed by foreigners, by permanent residents, just as the speechwriter Lysias and his brother. And you can see one example in the next slide. So Lysias, who is a foreigner, says, "We received not the smallest degree." So this speech comes from after democracy was reinstated. In the end of the 5th century, there were 2 oligarchic coups. This speech comes after the second oligarchic regime. And Lysias is defending his brother on court, and he describes how badly they were treated by the oligarchs, whereas they are true and loyal to Athenian democracy, even though foreigners. So he says, "We received not the smallest degree of pity from them. Instead, because of our money, they behaved towards us just as others would have done if angered by very serious offenses. We did not deserve this sort of treatment at the hands of the city. We had sponsored all our choral performances and contributed to many war taxes, eisphore. We had conducted ourselves well and had done everything required of us. We had made no enemies, but had ransomed many Athenians from the foe. In these matters, they clearly did not believe that we, as metics, should behave in the same way that they behaved as citizens." So we see that the similar arguments can be made by foreigners and by Athenians in public discourse. In this context, by honoring foreigners with paying capital taxes with the Athenians, as we saw earlier in the inscriptions, the city, in fact, gave to non-citizens not only the obligation or the honor to pay as much as the Athenians, but it also gave to foreigners the privilege to get involved in the same public discourse of reciprocity with the city, of benefaction and reward as the Athenian citizens. So they could use the same arguments as them. From the perspective of the wealthy Athenian citizens, such a state practice increased the pressure upon them to perform their civic obligations as well as possible in order to distinguish themselves. Because now they had to compete not only with other wealthy citizens, but also with wealthy foreigners, a broader group of people who could resort to the same kind of benefactions and to the same kind of rhetoric in order to influence public opinion and in order to enhance their standing in the community. From the perspective of the state, of the city, this honorific practice could only have a positive outcome on the community, I think. More wealthy individuals, both citizens and non-citizens, were to compete in equal terms for the gratitude of the city. Interestingly, we have one inscription, this is the one you see on this slide, which honors a metic and his ancestors for paying the capital taxes according to the laws. This is very interesting because, as far as I know, there is no surviving inscription which honors a citizen on similar grounds, just because he fulfilled his obligations according to the laws and nothing more. And this may be indicative of the greater demands that the city had of its own citizens and the greater pressure it put on them to go the extra mile when performing their civic obligations. So the city was not willing to to honor its own citizens just because they stayed within the law. But it did it occasionally with foreigners. To sum up, what I have tried to show today is that it was not only the position of the poor Athenian citizens that was affected by the presence and contact with foreigners. Looking at the other end of the social ladder, we see that there are cases in which wealthy Athenians shared common obligations with groups of wealthy foreigners, whether they were residents, refugees, political exiles, or merchants. One of these obligations is the payment of the capital taxes. The payment of the capital taxes, then, was an act that could express at the same time citizenship and foreignness. It could express the status of the Athenian citizen as much as it could express the status of the foreigner. What are the implications of this practice for a wealthy foreigner, for a wealthy Athenian, and for the city in general? A wealthy foreigner who was granted the privilege to pay the capital taxes with the Athenians through the fulfillment of a civic obligation was granted the honor of being closer to the citizenry, what it meant to be a citizen in practice and what it meant to be a wealthy citizen. And here I agree with the rationale of Whitehead that I mentioned earlier, so the honorary dimension of this practice. As far as the wealthy Athenian citizens are concerned, I cannot point to any concrete evidence that this practice was viewed by them as usurpation of the performative aspects of their citizenship. But at the same time, we can assume that such a practice would probably alert them, as they would perceive that this proximity with the wealthy foreigners could be costly to them. Now they were forced to share with foreigners some of the grounds on the basis of which they could make a claim for public recognition and for public gratitude. More people competing for the same awards. Even if this honorific practice may have affected negatively the wealthy citizens, I do not think that we can talk about a social cost which affected negatively the broader community, as Engen puts it. Quite the opposite. My suggestion is that through this honorific practice, the polis increased the civic-minded competition among the wealthy citizens. Advertising, as these inscriptions do, the payment of capital taxes with the Athenians as a reward was also a way to reinforce and consolidate the ideal of being a good and useful citizen for purposes of internal consumption. Because in fact, what these inscriptions promote is the idea that just to be able to fulfill civic obligations is an honor in itself. And in this way, these inscriptions also encourage wealthy foreigners to adopt the ideology of the city because they welcome them to perform civic obligations well. So in the case of classical Athens too, contact with non-citizen groups contributed to shaping ideas of citizenship. By granting to foreigners selective and controlled access to what it meant to be a citizen in practice, the polis at the same time reinforced the civic obligations of the citizens themselves and also encouraged them to perform themselves, and also encouraged them to prove themselves worthy of the honor of being an Athenian citizen. Thank you.
Thank you, Myrto, for this delightful lecture, very enlightening too. And now we have some time for questions. If anyone wants to make a question, can do it in Portuguese too, I can translate.
And in the last slide, we can see some bibliography.
Well, may I start then? I have a question. So, no, this figure, the figure of the Xenos, is omnipresent in whole Greek literature since Homer. Yeah, I'm very interested in the 5th century because of the sophists. Because then we have a very specific figure who is not only a Xenos, and he does not pay taxes, as far as we know. For example, there is a fragment about Gorgias where it said that he did not pay any tax, and he did not buy any property in order not to pay the taxes. But although they do not have this, how can I say this, this public honor, the civil honor, they do have great influence on the way citizenship is built because of their intellectual influence, because of the way they act upon the youngsters. And Plato gives many examples of healthy people receiving this office. One of them is precisely the Lysias and the Polemarchus in the Republic. So we still have their father, Cephalus, who has got rich because he was selling shields. So it's not kind of something an Athenian would do, selling shields. It's too banal. But he got rich, and he's interested in philosophy, so he's hiring this sophist Thrasymachus. Anyway, so just in this context, at the same time, the sophists seems to uproot the traditional values, so they are seen as a kind of threat by public speech. I'm interested in a specific passage of Plato's Sophists. I just would like to see what you think about, because it seems kind of enigmatic for me. And in the beginning of Plato's Sophists, so they receive this Xenos from Elea, and Socrates says something quoting Homer. He quotes Homer and says, he's not sure whether this Xenos is a man or a god, because since he is a Xenos, he has a kind of distance from the public life, from the city, and he can behold the city from above, like he were a god or something. So would you see some kind of, I don't know, epistemological virtue in being a foreigner, in being a Xenos? Because it seems that they can judge better the city, and that's why they can be dangerous. That's why the sophist can be dangerous, because he's aligned to the city in a certain sense, and he can see it better.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks also for bringing in philosophy, which is not my field, but it's always inspiring to go to this text. I think that two conditions are really important in order to understand, in my perspective, this passage and the relationship of the citizen and the foreigner. One is Plato, and the idea that he may, the Xenos can be a god or a man, but the important thing is that the Xenos is the other, right? Even in that case. And the other important condition is the period, the 5th century. So all these inscriptions come from the 4th century and late 4th century, where Athens is in a completely different situation compared to the 5th century, and compared to a time when it was an intellectual hub, right? In a way that it was not in the 4th century. So in the 5th century, perhaps the interaction, the lived interaction in Athens between citizens and foreigners had an intellectual flavor that we don't see, at least in the sources of the 4th century. In the 4th century, it gets more pragmatic. It is about how we can benefit from the foreigners because we need them, because we need their contribution in all sorts of ways. So definitely in the fifth and in this passage, we get this idea of a very active role of the foreigner, right? But in a different way compared to the fourth. Yes. I'm thinking about it. It's a very interesting passage. What do you think?
No, I'm not sure too, but it's the figure of the other. That's
Yes,
the point. And for the
absolutely.
philosophy, the other is always important because if you have the other, you have yourself. So you can
Yes,
understand yourself.
absolutely.
But in the 4th century, would you consider also the fact that Philip, in the case, was this, because like we have the letter of Speusippus and also an embassy that Xenocrates, one of the heads of Plato's Academy, did to Macedon in order to get the favor of the tyrant. So he's Xenos. They do not put water into the wine. They are barbarian even. But they kind of accept them because the city is poor, because the city has this practical issue. So this is, would you say, a feature of the 4th century? That they need to be practical regarding the foreigners in order to get money.
I think so. So the city, for its survival at this time, sometimes they cannot do otherwise, even if they want. But at the same time, it is important to stress that they don't give citizenship that easily. So they still have the means, let's say, to keep the foreign element out in some sorts of ways. But when it comes to the Macedonians, once they have overpowered them, they cannot disregard them. They need their favor and everything. And in the end, they are worshipped as gods themselves in Athens, Alexander.
Yes.
And yeah.
No, and the most interesting topos, which is, it seems a topos, because in the same way that happened in Athens, it happens nowadays, like the way we treated foreigners, if they are rich or if they are poor. It's the same in Brazil, it's not only Athens, Greece.
Absolutely,
It's the same
yeah.
in Brazil. If you are rich, or if you are black, or if you come from Africa or Germany, the treatment will be different.
Yeah.
So it's not about the fact of being a strange or foreigner, it's about the money too.
Exactly, yes.
Não quero dominar.
Thank you for your presentation, Myrto. It was very interesting. I have a question about the rights granted to foreigners. Some of the inscriptions you've shown grant foreigners not only the right to pay capital taxes, but also to own land, which is very significant. I was wondering if we could explain that by presupposing some sort of connection between the two rights, so that one was the condition for the acquisition of the other right. I don't know if there's some sort of discussion about that.
Thank you. So these two rights, the right to own land and the right to pay the capital taxes with the Athenians are separate. So we have inscriptions granting the one but not the other. We have, I think, many more inscriptions giving the right to own land compared to the inscriptions to pay the same capital taxes. And of course, if you own land, then you are liable to other taxes, the property taxes. So doesn't stop there. But the right to own land in practice makes sense when someone is a permanent resident of the city. Because in that case, you want to, I don't know, buy a house or have a little farm or whatever if you're staying in Athens. But at the same time, rights that look very practical can be completely honorific as well. So we have, for example, foreign kings or heads of foreign states that are granted this kind of rights in Athens. But the Athenians, of course, know that a king from Bosporus will not come and stay in Athens. It's purely honorific. So it can have both faces. It can be a purely honorific thing, or it can be practical. And in this respect, it is always important to know who is the person who is honored, because then we get to see if this is something that had significance in practice, or whether it was a matter of external politics, granting an honor to someone just to honor them. But those two are not related in any case, those two rights.
Some of these obligations that they were allowed, the foreigners were allowed to fulfill, were the so-called liturgiae.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right?
Yes, it's right. They could participate in some of the liturgies. They could even be sponsors of theatrical performance, but not in the big festival, not in the Dionysia, in lesser festivals like the Lenaia. There they could. Yes, absolutely. So this is another field in which foreigners and citizens may compete.
But Myrto, is there a point where they are allowed to own land? Because as far as I remember, in the 5th century, they are not. Or maybe I'm wrong. Do you know where they begin to own land?
I don't remember exactly, but I don't know if there is a time when all of them get this right. I know that in the 4th century it's an extraordinary honor. So they get the honor. In the 4th century, I think it starts, but I don't remember exactly when.
As far as I remember, it was impossible in the 5th century. Like no foreigner would have land, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yes, I don't remember exactly when it starts, but for sure we have evidence from early 4th century.
Myrto, I was pleased with your lecture. Thank you.
Thank you.
I am an undergraduate student, so I just want to say I really like to see how the connection between one speech in one side produces a kind of a right, a citizenship right, but in the other side, it's a linguistic gesture or something that needs a discourse. And at this point, I was looking for the reciprocity that you pin out, but maybe I was interested in hear a bit more. The point is, in one side, the foreigners, they pay the taxes and get access to Athenian citizenship. And in the other side, they reinforce one identity. So in this double movement, I was looking for the the connection with reciprocity. If you could explain a bit more, please.
Thank you. If I haven't understood the question correctly, please stop me and let me know. But as far as I understand, you want to see the connection between how taxes can produce a sense of reciprocity. That's what you meant. How these acts can be translated into acts of benefaction.
I am very interested in the concept of reciprocity, and I'm not sure if you were working with it, but I heard. So the point is, as I see, you made a connection or more, but one of them, it implies something realistic, empirical, which means you pay a tax and you become a citizen, which is an empirical resolution. And there's another level, which is on the level of the performative and the discourses. And I'm not sure where it's gonna, if it's gonna make sense for you, but I am very interested in reciprocity. So I was just asking if you see any connection.
Yes, I got it now. Actually, I think it's purely a matter of discourse that can have some practical advantages, but I do not think there is a direct connection between paying taxes and getting something back. I don't think there is such a direct connection, but you can do acts that are pleasing to a democratic audience that would put you in a better light. But I don't think that there is such a direct connection between performing your duties and getting something back. And there is not such a direct connection because many people can make the same argument and many people can act in this way. So in a trial, let's say, both the prosecutor and the defendant could be, and usually were, rich people. Both of them would have performed services for the city. Both of them could bring evidence that they were loyal Democrats and so on. So it was not usually about calculating who had done more and giving back the exact amount, but it was about building the persona of the good Democrat who has some social capital in storage to use in situations where he was in danger, and such situations were cases such as legal problems, a trial. But again, this was not the main way in which, I don't think that anyone would win a trial just because they would provide these sorts of arguments, unless the trial itself had to do legally with such kind of matters. But I think it was a much broader, so more a matter of discourse and rhetoric that could be capitalized to a certain extent, but not, I think, an absolutely direct link, such as the one that Alcibiades, for example, is trying to do in Thucydides' book 6. He's very direct. He says, I won in the Olympic Games 3 times with all my chariots. I have to stand above you. I am better than you. And this is why he is not accepted by the Athenians. This is why they are afraid of him, because he challenges the very basis of Athenian democracy. And this is why they lose him as a general as well. He was the best general Athens could have. But they lose him because they are at awe. They are afraid of them. He is too dangerous for the city. So the argument that Alcibiades makes in Thucydides' book 6 is never made in public discourse after him. This is not the kind of rhetoric that you can use in public discourse and win the people. So it's much more delicate, and you have to take into account a lot of parameters, and democracy and egalitarianism are really important in this discourse. I don't know if I answered your question. Yeah.
But it's curious that they tried to play Democrats in the 4th century. In the 5th, okay, like Alcibiades, but in the 4th, with the Macedonian domination, it's curious. Okay, Demosthenes we can understand, but even Aristotle, for example, he remained in Athens during the government of Antipater, so he had this protection, but he was always seen as a foreigner. He had to leave Athens when the Macedonian... Like, it seems that this, I don't know, kind of German blood and something like this in the Athenians, that they remain faithful to the idea of being a citizenship, and this means blood, and that means to be born in Athens or something.
Yes,
Just
yes,
a comment.
absolutely. But also I think that the democratic constitution, democracy in practice in the 4th century is much more complicated and maybe stronger than in the 5th, in the sense that it might be a bit less radical in some respects, but there are a lot of things to make sure it's not overthrown, it's not overturned, and so on. So it becomes a much more complicated system of governing that safeguards itself in various ways.
Hello. I have just a simple question. Why would someone come from another city and want to become a METEC in Athens? What would be the advantages? That's because this man had some problem in his original city, or there are some advantages in to be a METEC in Athens, to be a merchant, or to do some work that the Athenians would not like to do, and some kind of things.
Thank you. There are various reasons for which foreigners would like to come to Athens. So first of all, they might be forced to. As we saw, there are groups of people that are forced to come to Athens. And in some cases, they might eventually stay permanently or go back. We don't really know. But also, financial, economic migration is for sure a reason. We have the port of Piraeus, which is very active. And actually, we know from archaeological evidence that big community, the biggest communities of foreigners are around the port. So there we have foreign cults because foreigners lived there, and they lived there because they were doing business with the port. So for sure, there were financial opportunities. And then they were also involved with banking, as far as I know. It was an activity not usually done by Athenians. Banking was done by foreigners. It was done by slaves as well. We have cases of Passion, Apollodorus' father. Apollodorus was a minor orator of the 4th century. He was a slave. He managed to make so much money through banking that he bought his freedom and he became very rich, and his children as well. So we see also some cases of social mobility within Athenian society as well. We don't have very much evidence. I'm not aware of very much evidence, but I'm really glad that Kostas Vlasopoulos is starting this huge project on slavery, ERC project at the University of Crete on slavery in the whole of the Mediterranean. And this will bring to light a lot of things about slaves, not only in the Greek world, but much more broadly. And, you know, to look at these people as entities in themselves, in their life, and so on, because a lot of scholarship so far is about viewing these people through the lens of the Athenians.
Mais alguém, pessoal?
I would just like to thank you for your talk and for being here with us. And it was a great pleasure to hear you today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, then we thank you again, Myrto,
Thanks,
for this
Michael.
lecture.
Thanks, everyone.
And hope for the next one, since we are going to stay in Brazil for 1 year.
Absolutely, I'll be happy. Thank you.